Instead, we have the opportunity to make a habit of empathy, to recognize ourselves in each other.
I am Matthew Albracht. I'm the Managing Director of the Peace Alliance. The Peace Alliance does a lot of work around advocacy towards building the political and cultural will to really help foster a culture of peace. So we look a lot at the underlying causes of peace and the underlying causes of violence and whether it's cultural, physical, social violence, emotional violence in all its forms. We really look at what's possible in decreasing the violence that permeates so many areas of our society and communities and our own hearts. So we do a lot of work. Very specifically, we advocate for legislation that would help put structures and funding in the government to fund programs, projects that promote peace. Peace building in particular is a field of work that is pretty wide-ranging, from gang violence intervention programs to school violence programs to international conflict and violence and war. It's a really large gamut of what people are doing to help decrease violence and create the conditions where a more peaceful society can emerge. So we're in many ways promoting more peaceful solutions to the problems we face.
So it's a very broad approach for somebody.
Yeah, it's a very broad approach. It's it's sort of there's a field out there, and there's a lot of names for it: violence prevention, conflict resolution, nonviolence, restorative justice. I mean, there's so many different elements to it, and they're all working to create a new way of dealing with how we deal with conflict. A lot of people believe that conflict is not, a lot of people think that conflict is inevitable, but violence is not. And so it's looking at how do we work with conflict to keep it from becoming violent.
Well, and what I'm exploring is the theme of empathy and the value and emotion and feeling of empathy. How do you see that empathy and peace kind of relate?
Well, empathy seems to be a pretty core component to peace. One of the most core parts, in the sense that, for us to function in a psychologically healthy way, we have to be able to relate to one another, understand one another, and I'm sure there are lots of definitions for empathy, but the sort of empathic understanding that we can have for one another is pretty essential if we're really going to have deep respect and compassion towards each other. So I think it's core.
So it's kind of like a core part of peace. Would you say it's like the first step, maybe, or?
I don't know how to order, but it's certainly essential. I mean, if we can't cultivate more empathy for one another, both individually and collectively, whether it's nation to nation or political party to political party or whatever the form, if we don't have empathy for one another, we're not ever going to be able to really communicate in any way that's going to move beyond the conflict and into understanding and possible solutions for whatever we're looking at. It's central. It's key. It seems to be one of the most important elements. Yeah.
So if you kind of look through the narrative of your life, the arc of your life, how has your kind of awareness of empathy and peace kind of developed? For example, was your family very empathic? Did you kind of learn it there, or did you learn lessons along the way?
Well, I don't know about family. I mean, empathy, I guess respect is probably the word that was core for me growing up, that you have and hold respect for other people, and that was a very, very core value. And that's probably not the exact same as empathy. I'm sure it's not, but there's certainly a close relationship there. I think suffering for a lot of people can create greater empathy. So whatever my story was in my own life of what I went through growing up, or even as an adult, sort of that for me really landed as a greater compassion and empathic understanding of others, and really it gave me pause, and still does, when I go to judgment or when I go to anger. I'm always bringing myself back to what is the other person's story, what is really going on for them. How can I sort of get in touch with that, which brings greater understanding to me and greater compassion, and usually sort of brings down whatever my emotion is that might be a barrier to that relationship. It really helps me to kind of lower that wall, and then often come to a better place of understanding and resolution.
Well, you start off by talking about respect. Like, how do you see the relationship between respect and empathy?
Well, I think respect and empathy probably relate in the sense of it's really about, or I see it as honoring another human being. It's like acknowledging that they matter, that they mean something, that I am aware of that basic element. And I think they may take different forms in terms of what's going on, but the connection is there in terms of being compassionate, having respect for someone. I mean, they're different, but I guess I don't know. I don't know exactly. There seems to be a relationship, but I'm not sure if I can articulate it deeply. Yeah, that's a tough thing you have to
think about on the spot. The reason I kind of wonder about the relationship between empathy and respect is because I went to some of these demonstrations, and I interviewed African Americans who were at the Oscar Grant demonstrations, and a lot of them would say, "We want respect." Empathy is this wimpy thing. We want respect, kind of thing. So I was just trying to make sense.
Well, I think respect is probably easier for people to swallow. It's like, I think a lot of people think of things like empathy, compassion, love as weak. As this society in particular, showing emotion, being in touch with our emotion is a sign of, I think, weakness. Or people perceive it as a sign of weakness. There's a lot of fear around being vulnerable. And so, I think it's possible that a lot of people mix up empathy, with some sort of weakness. I mean, we tend to be a fairly punishment-oriented society where when they feel like there's some wrong or something that has occurred that's unjust, we tend to go very quickly to punishment. How do people pay for what they've done? And that, more often than not, doesn't resolve any of the real issue that's going on, and in most cases doesn't even provide much solace or resolution for the people that are involved on either side of it. So, I think there's a lot of cultural challenges that we have developed and have grown up in and emerged in that kind of keep things like empathy from really being able to be deeply honored. So when you say something like respect, that it's a much easier word for people to get a hold of, because respect is just, it's less, I guess, emotionally driven and more just kind of like a core. I don't know exactly what I would say respect is, but it's not as touchy-feely as say empathy would be, in this culture, I don't think.
Sometimes I think that the respect might be part of a hierarchical worldview. Is that you see yourself within the hierarchy and you say, well, you have to respect people, you can't look down or something, but it still kind of comes out of that hierarchical kind of a worldview, whereas empathy seems more of a
connection, a real deeper connection.
Yeah. View. So
it's like that phrase that I've heard over the years, and I don't know who from. It's not enough for us to have tolerance for one another, but it's much more important to really have understanding and compassion for one another. Tolerance only takes you so far. What I think we're really needing and deeply desiring, whether we're conscious of it or not as a culture, is a much deeper compassion, connection, empathy, things that have a lot more intrinsic value and have a lot more juice and fuel for, evolution.
Well, one of the things I really look at is like, what can we do to build a culture of empathy, which is kind of my main thrust right now, is what are the things that we can do to start kind of changing society to have more empathy and support the value of empathy.
Well, I think part of it would be to really understand the value of it. And so to make a commitment to really exploring that, I think a personal commitment to looking at our own judgments, at our own conditioning, and seeing what it is that things like empathy mean and what value they hold for us, and then making a personal commitment to trying to embrace it more, and looking for ways to explore what empathy could mean, what it could look like, whether it be, you know, through programs like nonviolent communication that teach, you know, great ways to be more empathetic to people, and actual tools to use it and to monitor it in your own mind and heart. I think that's one way, is to look for ways to cultivate it. And you know, again, the first thing I guess would be to really commit to it, to being more empathetic and understanding the value. And also understanding the downside to not being empathetic and the cost. Personally, collectively, politically, there's a big cost. So really looking and exploring what a lot of people share with us when, you know, we're in the peace movement. People say, oh, you know, you're never going to have peace. It's a pipe dream. It's, you know, fuzzy thinking. It's not going to happen. And because they haven't seen it modeled particularly well. And yet it is modeled in certain places, and there are structures and programs that help build empathy and better, deeper connection with one another. And they're incredibly effective, and it's something that we have to learn to do. It's sort of like cultural deprogramming or personal deprogramming. You know, a lot of kids are really, it seems they're so much more open, you know, as children who are much more unfettered by the world. They haven't learned it all yet. So they haven't learned these sort of walls and conditioning that we put around ourselves to protect ourselves. And so they move into the culture and into sometimes positive models, sometimes not, often not, more often than not positive models. And then we emerge into the society and start to function the way we do, but it's not necessarily that that's human nature so much as what we've learned. And there are lots of ways to learn to be more empathetic. And so we have to look at what those things are, and in some cases really retrain ourselves to be more empathetic and more compassionate to one another.
So it sounds like one of the aspects was to see the costs of, hey, when we're not empathic, what is this costing us personally, perhaps in our society?
Right, to look at the costs of, you know, when we're not empathetic with one another, for example, let's just take one of the extremes, which is criminals or people who go through the criminal justice system, maybe even people who have been in prison. For a lot of people, it's a tough thing to be empathetic with, certainly tough to be compassionate with. The people who commit crime or do sometimes heinous things, sometimes less so. To not really understand where they're coming from, what's causing it, and what might bring people out of it. We have we're one of the most incarcerated nations on the planet, by far. We spend more money by far, per capita, not just as a total, because we're a large country, but per capita we spend far more money on building prisons and on our criminal justice system than most of not only the Western world, but a lot of other parts of the world that one would think would be worse than us. We're actually one of the worst. And that has a huge cost. It has a cost not only financially, which of course it's tremendously expensive, over $65 billion a year on prisons that we spend. But emotionally, you know, for the millions of people that are in prison, for their families, for their communities, those people come out of prison. They go back into society. And very often they're hardened from prison worse than before they entered. And they bring that back to the community. And we all pay that price. You know, so when we don't have an empathic understanding of what people go through, we often miss a whole layer of what could help shift and create, you know, where the cost would be a lot less. In fact, when they go through programs, when we look at rehabilitation, especially in innovative programs, what you see is it's far cheaper. It's much better to spend money on rehabilitation, which very often the good programs are based in good empathic understanding of the people running the programs and working with the people who are doing it and teaching skills like empathy to people. What happens is we spend a lot less money It's a lot better for the community. These are people who go back into the community with these new skills and into their families, and help change the cycles and the patterns in their own small way and sometimes big ways. So the costs are great for not being empathetic, I think, and I think it's a value that if we don't begin to really take hold of and find ways to really implement, we're going to keep paying the cost over and over, and the cycles are going to expand and worsen, I think.
Well, it's not like the first idea you had was kind of do like a personal exploration of empathy, like what is empathy, kind of looking at it. Is that right? It was kind of and what is it not? And
right, and I wouldn't have a lot specifically to say about what are the resources one could look for. I mean, there's therapy, there's good self-help books, there's programs and classes you can take on things from anger management to nonviolent communication to marriage classes, relationship classes. I mean, there's a lot of things I think people can tap into to discover. Empathy is core to a lot of that, and sort of learning to be more empathetic to one another and compassionate to one another is going to be core in a lot of that. So it's just it's exploring what has meaning for you. What's an area that you would like to improve on, and really searching tools out. I'd love to see more resource databases that people could tap into around empathy, and maybe that'll be something that continues to develop. Because nobody has the same needs. I mean, nobody has the same desires or things that they connect with, and so it's nice to have an array of things that people can tap into, but I don't know specifically what I would suggest other than nonviolent communication. It's a great tool.
Well, that was it. So kind of do this personal exploration and then kind of make a commitment.
There's certainly no dearth of tools and resources out there. There's no matter what community you're in, there's something that you can tap into. And given the internet and what's available virtually, there's a lot virtually available too, for free, that are resources that you can look into. But it's a matter of making a commitment to finding those and exploring what that means.
Well, there's always my website, largest collection of material on
Oh, good. Perfect. There you go. I mean, that's the thing. That's what's nice, right?
Experts, all kind
that's
of
what's
stuff.
right.
What I'm trying to do is create that.
Yeah.
That
but look, personally, the other thing about the cost of not being empathetic is the personal price we pay. It's like, there's these big collective things that we pay in our society, but personally, it's like in our relationships, failed marriages, failed relationships, parents and children who have an extreme lack of deep connection with one another. I mean, it's like when we don't give ourselves the space and the time to have empathy for the people that we love and that are closest to us, which is sometimes hard to do in the midst of stress or anger or frustration. But when we don't, the price can be huge in terms of isolation and lack of deep, meaningful connections with other people and deep and meaningful community that I think all of us long for, whether we admit it or not. We all want to feel connected to something greater than ourselves and have both a support system and companionship. And so, that's the greatest price that we pay when we don't let empathy be a guiding principle in our life.
I think for me that's one of the strongest parts of empathy is that sense of connection. My parents are evangelical Christians. The world is created in 6,000 years. Can vote Republican and all that kind of stuff. And I used to kind of like fight with them all the time about things. But now I just kind of listen and try to reflect what I'm hearing, and it's kind of really deepened the connection, I find.
Yeah, I agree. It's like in the relationships that I've had, whenever I've really let go and just started to listen and understand more, it's relieving. It's like, it's not only relieving, it's fulfilling. It's like all of a sudden I start to discover a whole other realm of understanding isn't the word, but sort of a whole other realm of connection possibilities, because I can really just let go of whatever my chatter is and just see and hear what people are feeling. And when I do that, I'm certainly my happiest.
Do you have like a definition of empathy? Like how do you kind of define it?
Empathy, I guess, I don't have a preordained one, but I'll just start talking about what I see it as, I guess. I guess empathy would be listening, opening ourselves up to understanding and having some compassion for others. There's the cliches like putting yourself in someone else's shoes, but that's a pretty big thing to do, to really sort of step out of our own story of whatever we make meaning of in our lives, and trying to look through a lens that someone else might be seeing through, and trying to understand that. There's a lot to learn there. It's a pretty rich place to be in. So I guess that's how I would say empathy is, just kind of really finding the compassion and the connection with others from really opening ourselves up to their own story and what they're feeling and thinking and living.
So it sounds like the compassion is kind of an important part to you.
It is to me. I mean, I don't know the technical definition of empathy, the dictionary would say, but for me, empathy has an element of compassion that I would love to see part of the definition. It's not just understanding, but it's also it's got an emotional component as well that goes along with understanding. And then what is understanding? I mean, can you really understand someone else's perspective? It's sort of like maybe to varying degrees we can really understand, but sort of allowing some sense of understanding to become, trying to create a little more compassion, I think is a valuable.
Well, now you've been part of the peace movement. You're a real organizer within the peace movement, and I went to these like I mentioned, the Oscar Grant demonstrations, and there was an effort by the city to create kind of like peacekeepers that would wear vests and go and talk to people who are really agitated and so forth. So they had these meetings all around the city.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was taking part in that and videotaped those. And what I saw was kind of two kind of camps kind of developed. There was people who were for justice, and then the people who were for peace. And the two were a little bit at each other. It was like, which comes first, justice or peace, in terms of we are for peace and justice, or we're for justice and peace. Right. So there seemed to be a bit of a contention there. And the peace, people who are for peace were kind of more, not real aggressive. People who are for justice, there's a lot of kind of aggression. We're going to get out there and really do something, a lot of energy with that. And so that kind of dynamic was something I saw. What I'm looking at is the possibility of having like an empathy movement within that, to even see empathy as a different value that kind of maybe incorporates a bit of those two.
Right.
Because empathy has peace has a bit of an oppositional, it was seen as opposition to war in terms of how it's often perceived. Yeah. So there's kind of this dynamic going on. I'm trying to make sense of that and see how to bring in empathy into that dynamic.
Yeah. Well, it's Dr. King, Gandhi, of course, started this sort of, well, I don't know if he started, but certainly Gandhi and Dr. King were big proponents of the idea that we be the peace we want to see in the world. Really having embedded in whatever our cause is, if we're peace activists, that the ends don't necessarily justify the means, that we really have to live and be the principles that we are espousing. And so there's a large peace community, and it includes a wide variety of people who consider themselves peacemakers. And, for some people, some of the angrier people that one might meet might consider themselves peace activists. Who's to say what people should or shouldn't do necessarily, but one thing is it's really hard to be heard and to be taken seriously when you're screaming at someone, or when there's an overabundance of energy. Sometimes it's needed, sometimes it's the only thing that wakes people up, to have that sort of in your face. And so I'm not saying it's not needed, but it's certainly not the answer. It's not going to take us to the end point that I think a lot of us are looking for, which is, if you really want justice, what is justice? again, it's this idea of punishment. You know, we go so quickly to punishment. When we feel wronged, we want to punish, we want to lash out. And that's possibly core to who we are, but it's also probably a lot of learned behavior. When you truly combine peace and justice, then it's like you open up a lot of possibilities for what does a process look like to cultivate empathy and create a justice that really is going to transform a scenario. So do people on the streets who feel like they've been wronged want somebody to be punished, or do they want those things to stop happening? You know, and if you really want something to shift and change, then you really have to invest the time and the energy to look deeply at something. And so having empathy for each other would be one big component of looking at what would transform a situation so that if it feels unjust, it doesn't continue to happen. So, you know, it's hard because in one sense you have to be able to point out that, yeah, there are problems, there are injustices happening, and sometimes you have to do that with a bullhorn so people will hear you. But you also have to be able to let that go and let something move into a healing space where real solutions can arise and occur, you know. And that often it isn't on the table, and that's what I think frustrates a lot of people who feel like they're over and over and over they're oppressed. That, you know, if they don't scream, nobody's going to pay attention anyway. So it's a really tough place to be. It's why it's just as important, I think, that all of us commit to a system of justice that really looks to the needs of everybody, and that's where empathy comes in as well. That we can have empathy and better understanding of people who are oppressed and why they might be reacting in such strong ways or acting out, you know, in cases of crime or violence. You know, if we don't have more empathy all the way around, we're never going to get anywhere. We're just going to keep spinning these cycles of violence, you know. So empathy is really critical, because I think that's part of why we don't ever get to the place of any kind of transformation, because we never really understand where the other's coming from. You know, whether it's somebody who's oppressed or believes they're oppressed, who's just constantly got stuff pushing them down. You know, it's hard to understand why they're supposed to just allow that to happen. And from the other side, people who see a lot of people acting out, and they have a life that's going along smoothly and don't understand why they keep having to have all this in their face. You know, if they don't have empathy for the other side, it's a never-ending cycle. So empathy is probably the crucial component to starting a process that brings to healing. There are lots of forums for better justice that's really going to work and really going to change things. But it has to be agreed upon that that's something that would work and we're going to put our time and energy towards. And people have to have enough compassion for one another to allow that space to even be there. If they don't, then, you know, you can be as angry as you want or as mad as you want, and it's never going to change anyway. And the flip side's true. If the people don't start paying attention who need to pay attention, then problems are going to continue to occur. I mean, I think the more we put out what we want, I mean, that's the thing, is we often see people fighting against what they don't want, whatever that might be. But the more we put out what we really want and what's possible, I think the more it becomes a part of the cultural conversation. You know, so as people like our president, Obama, talk about empathy regularly in public, I think it helps create more understanding of what that is. And so the more we sort of hold up the signs of whatever it is we want, whether it be empathy or whatever it is, the more it's going to take hold, the more it's going to start to subtly, you know, I think a lot of the research says you have to see things a certain number of times before it starts to really become part of your understanding. So everything we can do, you know, is helpful. And the thing about empathy is the word is kind of powerful, I think. It's core to so much of what we need to really have healing in our culture. And we also need to put out tangible ways that it can be manifest. You know, so I think it's a great combination, not just to hold up the signs, but to have resources, like you said on your website. You have all the resources and, you know, videos, and, you know, that's what's really going to create a story. I mean, that is the only other thing I would say is if empathy is going to take hold, it's going to happen through stories, you know, in all the forms that they can come in. that's how we most deeply learn. And as it becomes a part of our cultural story, that's when it's really going to start to take hold for people, as they start to really look into that and what that means and tapping into it. So I think the more we can tell powerful stories through the various mediums, whether it's signs or resources or, you know, op-eds or whatever it is, the more it's going to take hold. That's the thing, you know, that's where I think my heart really started to open up, was when I started to have a little compassion for myself and really start to sort of like self-empathy. You know, when I started discovering self-empathy, and that I could really sort of give myself a little credit and compassion when I was feeling whatever I was feeling that didn't feel good. It was a pretty beautiful, tender opening, and it really changed my life, I think, in a lot of ways, to be able to just let myself feel what I was feeling, have some compassion for myself, maybe look at what it was coming from and understand that more. And that was relieving. And I think I started having a lot more compassion and empathy for other people because of that, you know, because I started to get more viscerally like, wow, maybe we're all doing this at one level or another. And what if I tried to have a little more connection with other people? You know, it just really opened up a whole new experience in my life of what it means to be here, and for me anyway, what it means to be here, and really changed my life for the better. For me, when I'm in empathy, it feels very relieving. It's the main word that comes to my head, and that's probably not an incredibly descriptive word, but I feel a sense of relief when I'm really listening to somebody and just letting go of judgments and whatever, and really trying to understand them better. I feel more connected to myself, certainly more connected to them. And I feel like I'm learning and growing just from hearing somebody's story and trying to go with them wherever they are, so that I really kind of get it viscerally. It feels freeing. And it feels like there's possibility there. Because I don't feel like I have to all of a sudden fight or, put my stake in the ground for where I stand. I feel like I can just really be with them. And more often than not, whenever I really am there and I'm really hearing and reflecting back, things soften for them too. They feel like they're being respected and connected with. And so often it'll help ease that tension, and then we have more chance for connection, and that feels great when you really connect with somebody, It's a good place to be in.
See the world through other people's eyes. Now, empathy is a quality of character that can change the world.